Dr. Anne Fitzgerald is a barrister. She's written the author of the Creative Commons, Introduction to Intellectual Property Law, Internet and E-commerce Law, Business and Policy. So she knows her stuff on this topic, and joining her on stage is Neal Hooper, who is a legal practitioner, so at the coalface of what's actually going on with this kind of data. So would you please welcome them both to the stage, Anne Fitzgerald and Neal Hooper. Thank you.
Okay, now I know that we're running short of time, so we're going to keep our presentation as short as we possibly can. What we're really going to talk about today is looking at a framework for information governance. So we've heard a lot of pretty interesting stuff. Neal and I have actually worked in this space for at least 10 years, where it's actually occupied a fair amount of our time, and for both of us, we're actually involved in information access, probably going back to probably around 2000 in an active way. So if we're actually going to use data and information to fuel the digital economy, we have to have some kind of system of governance that provides the framework for data access and use. When we talk about governance, we mean a system, processes, means, methodologies that enable the intended outcomes to be achieved in a more or less consistent or coherent manner. So an appropriately structured governance system should reduce complexity, avoid wasteful repetition, importantly short-circuit the stop-start cycle that we tend to have towards progress, that's particularly characteristic of some societies. I think Australia and I think Queensland are very much like that. We tend to take 2 steps forward, 1 step back, or even 2 steps back. We want to wait for another 10 years for someone to catch up. We can't afford to do that. The rest of the world is moving faster. We have to get more sensible about how we approach this. So we've heard a lot about how computers, equipment, submersible things, digital code, all play a role in controlling access to and use of data and information. But our focus is really on the policy and regulatory side of the equation. So there are various factors that need to be addressed. They need to be understood and really incorporated into the system that you have for managing your data. So the factors are interrelated, they're not exclusive, and unless each of them is addressed, it's going to be difficult to establish a governance system that effectively enables data and information to be accessed and used. You can see from our writings of the experience in Queensland over the last 10 years which ones of these were actually skipped over almost entirely. I'd say not just in Queensland but Australia generally. Which ones we used and which ones we really basically tapped into to achieve most of the progress so that they actually served a different function to what they should have been doing. So basically just to really, cover these in global kind of form. So first of all, you have to have some underpinning theory or rationale of your governance system. The concepts that justify its existence in form. The principles or rules based on that theory or rationale have to be described. So these are the principles or rules that guide action in providing open access and use of data and information. And thirdly, you have to have some means of implementing those principles or rules in practice in order to ensure that desired level of open access and use can be achieved. So a lot of what we hear at conferences like this is basically how people have gone about doing that without necessarily looking at the steps that really form the basis for that action to occur. And it's all great, it's fantastic, but there's a lot of background here that actually led to those innovations being put in place. So first of all, we need to have some kind of theoretical underpinning of the system of governance. So if you don't have an accepted theory or theories, you end up with conflicting perspectives and inconsistent principles, inconsistent actions. So the role of information flows in innovation has received a lot of attention in recent years, particularly in the context of the huge amounts of data that are now being generated in the digital economy. We talk about the data deluge. We've got so much data. We've got big data. We've got data analytics have all come on stream in the last 10 20 years. So fundamentally, we also understand that the value of information is derived from its use. So any theoretical basis for an information governance system has to be based on the role of information in innovation, how to access and use information to contribute to new knowledge, scientific discoveries, dissemination of innovation, development of new products, better ways of doing things, providing cost-effective services, better decision-making, etc. When we look at the principles or rules of information governance, we have to understand that openness does not occur by default. So we've been talking about openness being a good thing based on some sort of theoretical understandings we have of this. But it doesn't just happen by default. In fact, if you do nothing, the opposite to openness tends to occur. And you have to craft the degree of openness. You need to structure that degree of openness using principles, rules that guide action. So once you adopt your policy describing the extent to which data will be open for access and use, you have to establish these principles or rules to give effect to that policy. So the need for these kinds of statements of principle in open data systems is increasingly recognised. So we have a whole raft of statements of principle in documents that have been put out at the national, international, intergovernmental organisation level, the G8's Open Data Charter, the OECD's declarations, etc., the European Commission's directive on access to and reuse of public sector information. So where we have information in a closed, secure system, this is really what we're talking about if we go back much beyond about 10 years. Not only did we not have material in digital form, as we've just heard, a lot of this stuff, particularly in the spatial area, was actually really in analogue form. So if you possessed it, you could actually control it. Even when we started setting up digital computerised systems, you tended to find that the big data custodians really could control their system, so you could actually control what people could or could not do with it. But information in digital form is inherently fluid and infinitely perfectly reproducible. So once you actually start moving outside that controlled environment, outside those closely controlled information silos, you have to have some kind of enforceable rules or even laws. They become the predominant means of controlling information access and use. So where data and information are to flow in a shared or open system, the absence of rules is, particularly regarding ownership, rights to access and use, can actually act as a disincentive to publication and dissemination. If anyone can take my data and information and use it without any restrictions whatsoever, even though I want it to be open and shared, I don't want them to use it without acknowledgement of its origins, its provenance, its quality, its meaning. I don't want them to freely appropriate it without any restriction whatsoever. I'm going to be reluctant to actually open it for access for use, preferring to retain it and hold on to it, lest my connection with it is lost. So when we look at these principles and rules without going through a whole kind of swag of legal areas, there's a lot of law around information. This law already exists. It's grown up over the years, over the centuries. So, and it is really quite complex. So we have privacy laws, we have national security obligations, we have commercially confidential data and information. We have a whole lot of freedom of information laws which focus on access to information concerning administrative decision-making. However, the point at which we really came into this area, we can put aside all of that. We can say we're not going to deal with any data to which those issues apply or predominantly do not apply. But for the vast majority of jurisdictions worldwide, and here the United States federal government is probably the most significant exception, the fact that copyright exists in an extensive range of government informational materials and where sufficiently original factual databases and collections means that copyright is going to need to be actively managed in order to enable government data and information to be accessed and used. So like other copyright owners, governments and publicly funded research organisations and universities have an extraordinarily wide range of rights in their copyright as copyright owners. So while the entire rationale for endowing governments with copyright in the materials they produce was to actually support their distribution in an accurate form, governments have in fact relied on those rights to restrict the flow of their information and data, usually as part of rent-seeking schemes. So what we need to do, and this is where the Creative Commons licences came in, we can actually use those licences, particularly the least restrictive Creative Commons licence, the CC BY licence, apply that as the default licensing position for government copyright materials. So by licensing in this way, you facilitate access and use while retaining recognition of the origins of the material and ensuring that the government has sufficient rights to enforce the accurate reproduction and dissemination of the material. So the next set of factors that we have to look at is once we've worked out the underlying theory, the policy principles and rules that are informed by that theory, we then actually have to look at how we implement this in practice. So once those rules have been delineated, they really need to be integrated into an organisation's standard information management practices. Now, that's the kind of thing that we've been hearing a lot about, say in relation to particularly the federal government, the Queensland government with the establishment of the data.gov portals. So this step requires some training and guidance to be provided to those who generate or are responsible for curating the data. So as well as ensuring that the data managers understand the open access policy and its rationale, you need to have user-friendly steps, processes and tools available so that data managers can readily take those steps that are involved in complying with the policy. It should be simplified so that data managers understand the steps to take. So wherever possible, these steps can also be automated. So at this point, I'm going to hand over to Neal, who will actually talk a little bit more about the implementation issues and review that's actually been done of implementation of the open access policy and the Creative Commons licences, particularly at the federal government level.
Thanks very much, Anne. A very quick sort of end note really to this presentation. An instructive survey was undertaken or commissioned by the Office of the Information Commissioner at the federal government level, and what it dealt with was the examination of the use of the Creative Commons licences and was really in a broader context of talking about open public sector information basically meaning government information in the broad sense, and used it previously. And there are 191 agencies responded. This is a survey which was conducted essentially in 2012, 2013. It came a year after the Information Commissioner had issued a series of principles called Open Public Sector Information Principles. And it was instructive because there aren't very many hard surveys about government agencies implementing these kind of practices. And we have not in Australia had a comprehensive information policy as such. As you'll see from our writings, in effect what we've developed more effectively is a licensing policy for application by agencies to public sector information, hence open public sector information or open government information. The survey raised a number of questions and made some recommendations, but importantly in the present context, what the survey identified was that in relation to the principle of open access and the lawful reuse of public sector information, most of the agencies fully understood that. They got that message quite clearly and they were in fact committed to it. They were confronted, however, with some practical difficulties, and especially in relation to the smaller agencies. The more mature, larger agencies in relation to information management principles such as the ABS, BOM and Geoscience Australia, they unsurprisingly were more comfortable and were more efficient in applying the CC licences. Some have said that the CC BY licence is in effect a type of legal expression of the whole idea and policy of open access and reuse. What the smaller agencies, however, identified was that they were really lacking in leadership They required further instruction so that they had a clearer grasp of what was meant by open access and open access licensing. That message had not been sufficiently clearly communicated for them to be able to then move on and implement that in an operational level. So these are very concrete, perhaps mundane, but very important practical implementation steps which we need to, and I'm sure those same messages apply in large measure to the Queensland Government, which has been, as we've mentioned, in many respects at the forefront, in part at least through the QUT collaboration with the Queensland Government, in which Anne and myself were directly involved. So what we're really saying is here, we haven't got the information policy as such. We need those principles to flesh out the issues, to enable agencies to know what it is, what they're trying to achieve and how to implement it. It also makes it transparent from the public to know just what government is doing and facilitates that interchange between government and the business community and citizens more generally, so we can get to what we consider to be important. So from a practical point of view of implementation as a lawyer, and a government lawyer of well over 20 years, is we need to help agencies in collaboration with others to get on with the job. What they do need is helpful tools, practical guidance, very much coal-face considerations, not at the, if you like, more technical level of legal knowledge. As Anne said, that is not what we expect of agencies. They shouldn't be required to be experts in various areas. They should stick to their knitting, but have available to them the specialist advice as the need arises and provide them with tools which identify those issues that do need further attention as they arise. So I guess the takeaway message is practical focus at an operational level is essential if we are going to be able to efficiently and effectively deliver the objectives of open access and to public sector information. And they are both economic and societal values, and the value of information really only is realised through repeated reuse of that information. In other words, the value ultimately can be determined by the number of times and different ways in which it is used subsequent to its initial release, hopefully under a CC BY licence. Thanks very much.
Sorry, I just actually had to include this slide, which is the chronology as to how we actually came to apply Creative Commons licences. This will be included with your materials. Also, I just have some references there to the materials that we've been talking about today. You'll find a lot more of our stuff on our aupsi.info site and also in QUT prints. Thanks.